We are often taught that war is a cold game of mathematics, that 26,000 swords must inevitably crush 500, but beneath the burning sands of Montgisard lies a truth that defies all logic. A nightmare where a dying boy with a rotting face brought the greatest empire of the East to its knees. In the autumn of 1177, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was not a golden sanctuary, but a waiting room for the dead, while the Sultan Saladin marched with a force calculated to erase the Christian presence. The defense fell to Baldwin IV, a 16-year-old king whose flesh was being eaten alive by a disease that granted him one terrifying gift: the inability to feel pain. Before we unravel this impossible victory, do let us know in the comments from which city you are watching history unfold today. To understand the miracle of Montgisard, one must first step into the shadowed corridors of the royal palace of Jerusalem, a place where the air did not smell of incense or rosewater, but of something far more unsettling. A faint, sickly sweet mixture of strong herbal ointments trying desperately to mask the scent of decaying flesh. It was here, hidden away from the sun that scorched the Holy Land, that the young King Baldwin IV existed not as a monarch, but as a prisoner within his own body. History often paints kings in colours of gold and crimson, yet Baldwin's reality was painted in the greys of necrotic tissue and the white of linen bandages. His story begins not with a coronation, but with a childhood game, a moment of chilling realization recorded by his tutor. The chronicler, William of Tyre, in his extensive history, William describes a day when the young prince was playing with the children of the nobility. They were pinching each other's arms, a cruel game to test endurance. And while the other children cried out or pulled away, Baldwin remained silent, utterly indifferent, William wrote, with a trembling hand. That when he examined the boy's arm, he found the flesh numb, dead to the sensation of touch. It was the first whisper of the leprosy that would soon consume him, a divine curse. As many whispered in the dark corners of the court, sent to punish the sins of a kingdom built on blood. Imagine, if you will, the psychological torment of a boy who is told he is the chosen defender of the holiest city on earth. While watching his own fingers curl and stiffen, his skin developing patches that lost all colour and feeling by the time he ascended the throne at the age of 13. The disease was no longer a whisper, it was a scream. The courtiers who bowed before him didn't look him in the eye. They looked at the silver mask he was eventually forced to wear, a mask that has become the defining image of his legend. But we must strip away the romance of Hollywood to see the horror of the truth. That mask was not merely a dramatic accessory. It was a necessity born of unspeakable physical devastation. Beneath that cold, polished silver lay a face that was slowly collapsing in on itself. The cartilage of the nose dissolving, the lips receding to reveal teeth that seemed too large for a shrinking skull. To look upon the king was to look upon a memento mori, a living reminder of death sitting on the very seat of power. However, the true horror for Baldwin was not the pain, for the disease had cruelly robbed him of that. The true horror was the isolation in the medieval mind. Leprosy was not just a biological infection, it was a spiritual judgment. A leper was legally dead, often forced to wander the roads ringing a bell to warn the living of their unclean presence. Yet here sat a leper on the throne of Jerusalem. The contradiction was maddening to the religious zealots of the time. The political atmosphere around him was as toxic as the disease in his blood. The royal council was a pit of vipers. Ambitious counts and warlords like Raymond of Tripoli and Reynald of Chatillon, men who hovered around the young king like vultures waiting for a wounded animal to finally expire. They watched his every stumble, whispered about his inability to produce an heir, and plotted for the day his breathing would stop. They did not see a king. They saw a placeholder, a temporary inconvenience before the real game for power could begin. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that because his body was rotting, his mind must also be decaying. They were wrong, as his physical world shrank to the confines of his armor and his mask. Baldwin's mind sharpened into a diamond of clarity. William of Tyre noted that the king possessed a memory that terrified his advisors and a grasp of logistics that shamed his generals, while his body betrayed him. His will became an iron fortress. He learned to ride a horse not by gripping the reins with his fingers, which were useless, but by using his knees and the balance of his torso, a feat of physical adaptation that would be impressive for a healthy man, but was miraculous for one whose joints were swollen with inflammation. He trained his mind to ignore the fatigue that plagued him, to push past the limits of human endurance because he knew he was living on borrowed time. This was the state of Jerusalem in 1177, a kingdom led by a dying boy, surrounded by enemies without and traitors within. It was a city holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable collapse. And it was into this vacuum of hope that the shadow of Saladin began to lengthen from the south. A shadow that promised not just conquest, but annihilation. If Baldwin was the embodiment of chaotic decay, then the man rising from the sands of Egypt was the personification of vitality and calculated perfection. Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known to the fearful West simply as Saladin, at 40 years old. The Sultan was everything the young king of Jerusalem was not. He was physically robust, intellectually brilliant, and possessed a strategic mind that operated with the cold precision of a master chess player. He did not fight wars with passion. He fought them with mathematics. To understand the sheer hopelessness of the situation facing Jerusalem, we must look through the eyes of Saladin's own secretary and chronicler, Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, in his detailed records, which survive to this day. Imad ad-Din describes the army that assembled in November of 1177 not as a mere military force, but as a force of nature, a human tide destined to wash away the sins of the infidels. 26,000 men. It is a number that is easy to say, but difficult to truly visualize. Imagine a column of cavalry and infantry stretching so far that, as Imad ad-Din poetically noted, the dust kicked up by their march created a false twilight at noon, blotting out the sun. Among them were the Mamluks, elite slave soldiers trained from childhood in the arts of the bow and the lance, warriors whose loyalty was absolute and whose discipline was terrifying. They were not a rabble, they were a machine. Saladin had spent years carefully stitching together the fragmented Islamic world, uniting the wealth of Egypt with the manpower of Syria, effectively surrounding the Crusader kingdom in a stranglehold of steel. His invasion was not a raid for plunder. It was a final equation designed to solve the problem of Jerusalem once and for all. And the logic was flawless. Saladin knew that the Crusader states were starving for manpower. He knew, through his extensive network of spies, that Baldwin's body was failing. He knew that the Knights Templar were distracted defending border fortresses. When he looked at the map, he did not see a war. He saw a foregone conclusion. The math was simple. 26,000 against a kingdom that could barely scrape together a few hundred knights in any military academy in the world, past or present. The outcome of such a confrontation is not a probability, it is a certainty. This confidence led Saladin to make a decision that was, by all conventional wisdom, correct. Yet it would prove to be his undoing. Believing that the Leper King would never dare to leave the safety of Jerusalem's walls to face such overwhelming odds, Saladin allowed his massive army to disperse. He let them spread out across the countryside to forage and pillage, loosening the tight formation that made them invincible. Why keep 26,000 men in a tight defensive box when there is no enemy capable of threatening you? It would have been a waste of resources. It was a logical decision. It was a rational decision. It was the decision of a man who believed that reality operates according to rules. But Saladin had failed to account for the one variable that mathematics cannot quantify: the desperation of a man who is already dead. While Saladin's forces were leisurely burning villages and cutting off supply lines, believing themselves to be untouchable, a very different scene was unfolding within the walls of Jerusalem. The safe list of history often glazes over the terror of this moment, but we must pause to consider it. The kingdom was not just outnumbered, it was alone. No help was coming from Europe. The Pope's letters were slow, and the kings of the West were busy with their own squabbles. Baldwin IV was faced with a choice that was no choice at all. He could stay behind the walls of Jerusalem, as his advisors begged him to do. The walls were thick, the cisterns were full. They could survive a siege for months. But Baldwin understood something his healthy advisors did not. A grim wisdom born of his own terminal condition. He knew that a siege is just a slow death, a gradual suffocation where you watch your people starve while waiting for an end that is inevitable. It is the political equivalent of leprosy, a slow rotting from the outside in. And so, the Leper King made a decision that defied all military logic. A decision that made seasoned commanders weep with frustration. He ordered the levy. He scraped the bottom of the barrel. Every man who could hold a spear, every knight who could sit on a horse, was summoned. He stripped the garrison of Jerusalem to the bone, leaving the holy city virtually defenseless. It was a gamble so reckless that it bordered on madness. If he failed, and the math said he must fail, there would be no one left to defend the women and children inside the city. Jerusalem would fall in an afternoon. But Baldwin did not care for the math. He ordered his specialized mount to be prepared. He could no longer vault into the saddle like the knights of legend. He had to be lifted, his wasted frame light as a bird's, and placed onto the animal, because his hands were now so ravaged by the disease that he could not grip the reins. He essentially had to be strapped to the beast, his body becoming one with the horse. 500 knights, that was the sum total of his hope. 500 men riding out to meet 26,000 as they left the Jaffa gate, leaving the weeping civilians behind. They were not marching to war. They were marching to their own funeral, or so the logic of the world would have them believe. Imagine, for a moment, that you are one of those 500 knights. You are encased in 40 pounds of chainmail and boiled leather. The Palestinian sun is not merely hot, it is a physical weight, pressing down on your shoulders like an iron anvil. The air inside your helmet is stagnant, smelling of old sweat, horsehair, and the metallic tang of fear. Your body screams for water, for rest, for shade. Every instinct you possess as a living creature is telling you to turn back. But then you look to the front of the column. There, riding under the banner of the cross, is a figure who does not sweat, who does not shift in his saddle to relieve the cramping of his muscles, who does not ask for water. King Baldwin rides with a stillness that is almost unnatural, because his nerve endings have been incinerated by disease. The blazing heat that cooks the men inside their armor registers to him only as a dull abstraction. He pushes the pace not because he is cruel, but because his body has lost the ability to tell him to stop. It is a terrifying advantage. The endurance of a corpse applied to the strategy of a general. The destination was Ascalon, a coastal fortress that was vital to the kingdom's survival. If Saladin took it, the road to Jerusalem would be wide open. to get there before the enemy. Baldwin forced a march that would have killed lesser men. They moved like ghosts through the heat haze, a small ribbon of steel cutting through the vast, hostile dunes. It was during this desperate ride that they were joined by a force that would become the tip of Baldwin's spear. The Knights Templar. We must pause to understand who exactly these men were. For pop culture has turned them into treasure hunters or conspirators. In 1177, the Templars were the special forces of Christendom. Religious fanatics weaponized into the perfect heavy cavalry, led by their Grand Master, Odo de Saint-Amand. 80 of these warrior monks joined Baldwin's column. These were men who had sworn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But their most important vow was this: never to retreat unless outnumbered by more than 3-1, facing odds of 52-1. Even the Templars should have paused. Yet, when they saw the broken, bandaged form of their king strapped to his horse, refusing to yield, a grim resolve settled over them. If a boy with no future could ride to his death, so could they. They reached Ascalon just hours before Saladin's massive army swept past, and here lies the crucial mistake. The twist of fate. Saladin, seeing the small crusader force hole up inside the walls of Ascalon, dismissed them. In his mind, they were trapped. They were neutralized. He did not even bother to leave a large force to besiege them. He simply bypassed the castle and continued his march toward Jerusalem, confident that the fearful king would stay hiding behind the stone walls. It was an insult, a calculated dismissal, and it was exactly what Baldwin needed. From the ramparts of Ascalon, Baldwin watched the endless river of Saladin's troops flow past. Thousands upon thousands of men, baggage trains, and siege engines. A normal commander would have breathed a sigh of relief that the enemy had passed them by. But Baldwin was not a normal commander. He realized instantly that Saladin's arrogance had exposed his throat. By bypassing Ascalon, Saladin had left his rear undefended. The moment the main Muslim army disappeared over the horizon, heading for the defenseless Jerusalem, Baldwin did the unthinkable. He did not stay safe in Ascalon. He ordered the gates to be opened. "We follow them," he whispered, his voice ravaged by the lesions in his throat. The knights must have looked at each other in disbelief. To chase 26,000 men with less than 600. It was suicide. But then, they looked at the blood seeping through the king's bandages. The friction of the ride had torn open the sores on his legs and hands. He was bleeding into his armor, his body literally falling apart from the stress. Yet he was ordering the attack. This is the sandwich of history and horror. We must understand that for Baldwin. This was not just a military maneuver, it was a theological imperative. He believed that his disease was a test from God, and that his suffering had a purpose. If he could trade his broken body for the salvation of his people, it was a bargain he would make 1,000 times over. It was this terrifying piety that silenced the doubts of his captains. They rode out of Ascalon, shadowing the massive enemy force. They moved along the coast, hidden by the rolling terrain. Tracking the smoke rising from the villages Saladin was burning. The element of surprise was their only weapon. They needed to catch the mathematician when he was no longer counting. On the afternoon of November 25th, near the hill of Montgisard, the scouts rode back to Baldwin with eyes wide. They are stopped, they reported. They are crossing the river, they are spread out. Saladin's army, believing they were miles from any threat, had become a disorganized mob. They were crossing a wadi, a dry riverbed. Their baggage train was stuck in the mud. Their armor was packed away in wagons due to the heat. Their horses were unbridled to drink. They were not an army in that moment. They were a traffic jam. Baldwin sat on his horse, overlooking the valley. The pain in his joints must have been excruciating as the adrenaline began to fade. Or perhaps, in a mercy of his condition, He felt nothing but the cold vibration of the horse beneath him. He looked at the sea of enemies, a force that could swallow his little band of brothers without chewing. He signalled for the Bishop of Bethlehem to bring forward the true cross, a piece of wood believed to be from the very cross Christ died upon. As the relic was raised against the darkening sky, Baldwin did something that broke the hearts of every hardened killer present. He tried to dismount to pray. He couldn't. His legs failed him. He collapsed onto the sand, his body a heap of twisted limbs and bandages. His knights rushed to help him, but he waved them away, face down in the dirt, weeping not from pain, but from the sheer weight of the moment. The Leper King prayed for victory. When he was lifted back onto his horse, the tears were gone. The mask was back in place. He drew his sword, or rather, he had his sword tied tighter to his rotting hand. He turned to his 500 doomed men. He did not give a speech about glory. He simply pointed his steel toward the thousands of unsuspecting enemies below. The silence of the desert was about to be shattered. The collision of two armies is often described in history books with sterile words like engaged or clashed. But what happened at Montgisard was not an engagement. It was a butchery born of physics. Imagine the sheer kinetic energy of 500 heavy warhorses, each weighing over 1,000 pounds, accelerating to 30 miles per hour. Now imagine that force concentrated into a single, razor-sharp wedge, aiming directly at the soft, exposed belly of an army that was not wearing its armor. When Baldwin's knights hit the Muslim lines, the sound was not the ringing of swords. It was a sickening, wet thud. The sound of metal smashing into unprepared flesh and bone. The first rank of Saladin's army didn't fight. They simply evaporated. Imad ad-Din, watching from the rear, wrote with horrified fascination. They charged like a flame dropping onto dry wood. The shock was absolute. Saladin's men were caught with their helmets off, their shields strapped to pack animals, cups of water in their hands. They looked up to see not men, but monsters encased in iron, riding out of the sun like the riders of the apocalypse. And at the tip of this spear was the Leper King. This is the image that should haunt you. A teenage boy, his body a ruin of bandages and sores, tied to his saddle with leather straps so he wouldn't fall off from the force of the impact. He wielded his sword with his one good hand, slashing with a fury that terrified even his own bodyguards. To the superstitious soldiers of Saladin's army, seeing this figure, this faceless king with a silver mask reflecting the blood and the sun, it broke their minds before it broke their bodies. They thought he was a jinn, a demon sent by Allah to punish their arrogance. How else could you explain a corpse leading a charge? Panic is a contagion, faster and more deadly than leprosy. It started in the vanguard and swept backward like a wildfire. The enemy is here. The leper is here. The screams tore through the ranks. Men who were brave warriors, veterans of a dozen campaigns, threw down their weapons and ran, trampling their own comrades in a desperate bid to escape the White Death thundering toward them. Saladin, the genius tactician, the master of logic, stood on a small rise, watching his world unravel. For the first time in his life, the math did not work. He tried to rally his Mamluk guards, the elite yellow-clad warriors who had never known defeat. He screamed orders, trying to form a defensive line, to create a wall of spears that could stop the cavalry charge. But it was too late. The momentum of the crusade charge was unstoppable. They punched through the center, then wheeled and struck again, carving bloody furrows through the confused mass of humanity. The narrow terrain, which Saladin had failed to scout properly, became a killbox. The river he had been crossing became a trap, its banks slippery with mud and blood, preventing retreat. The battle devolved into a massacre. It wasn't a fight, it was a harvest. We must rely on the sensory details to understand the horror. As we cannot show the gore, the air grew thick with the copper scent of blood. So potent it could be tasted on the tongue, the ground turned into a slurry of red mud, and over the din of battle, the screams of horses, the prayers of dying men, there was the rhythmic, hacking sound of the Templar swords rising and falling, like threshing machines working a field of wheat. Baldwin, in the center of the melee, was beyond exhaustion. Medical experts analyzing his condition today suggest that the sheer physical trauma of the battle should have sent his body into shock within minutes. His heart was pumping blood through hardened arteries. His infected skin was rubbing raw against the leather straps. But he did not stop. He was in a trance state, fueled by a cocktail of adrenaline and religious ecstasy. He was no longer a leper. In these few hours, he was the wrath of God. Saladin himself was nearly captured. The Sultan, who commanded an empire stretching from the Nile to the Euphrates, was forced to flee like a common criminal. Primary sources tell us the humiliation was total. He escaped only by jumping onto a racing camel, abandoning his horse, his banner, and his entire baggage train. He rode into the desert with only a handful of guards, leaving 20,000 of his men to the mercy of the boy he had underestimated. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in colors that matched the field below, the slaughter finally slowed. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the cawing of crows already circling overhead. The mathematician of death had been schooled by a dying boy. The logic of numbers had been shattered by the logic of will. Imad ad-Din, writing later, in sorrow and disbelief, summarized the catastrophe with a poetic bleakness. God turned the wheel of fortune against us. We were like a cloud that brings no rain, dispersed by the wind. The earth was hidden by our dead, and the living envied those who had fallen. But as the adrenaline faded from Baldwin's blood, the reality of his condition came rushing back with vengeance. The king did not celebrate, he did not feast. When his squires finally cut the straps holding him to his horse, he collapsed into their arms, a broken puppet whose strings had been cut. The silver mask slipped, revealing eyes that were rolling back into his head. He had won the impossible victory, but as we are about to see, the bill for such a miracle is high, and it would be paid not in gold, but in the remaining fragments of his life. Victory is often portrayed as a moment of pure elation, of cheering soldiers and waving banners, but for Baldwin IV, the victory at Montgisard was a medical catastrophe. The human body is not designed to operate without limits, and the Leper King had just pushed his ruined vessel far beyond the boundaries of biological possibility. When the adrenaline finally drained away, the pain that returned was not the sharp sting of battle wounds, but the deep, dull ache of a systemic collapse. His physicians, stripping the armor from his body, were horrified by what they found: the friction of the saddle, the violent motions of combat, and the crushing weight of the chainmail had caused his lesions to rupture. The bandages were not just blood-soaked, they were fused to his skin. In saving his kingdom, Baldwin had effectively signed his own death warrant. The stress of the campaign accelerated the progress of his leprosy at a terrifying rate. Before Montgisard, he could still ride, still use his hands to some degree. After Montgisard, the decline was precipitous. He began to lose his sight. His hands, which had gripped the sword that broke an empire, curled into useless claws. He could no longer walk. He was 20 years old, while Jerusalem celebrated. Church bells ringing for days, people dancing in the streets, hailing him as the new Judas Maccabeus. The Saviour himself lay in a darkened room, his body burning with fever. It is a cruel irony that history often overlooks. The harder Baldwin fought to keep Jerusalem alive, the faster he killed himself. But the cost was not paid in vain. The sheer scale of the plunder taken from Saladin's abandoned camp was staggering. The Crusaders captured enough gold, weapons, and supplies to secure the kingdom for years. They took so many prisoners that the slave markets of the Levant crashed due to oversupply. Saladin, the invincible sultan, was humiliated. He returned to Cairo not as a conqueror, but as a fugitive. He told his scribes to erase the memory of Montgisard, but the scar remained on his psyche. He had learned a terrifying lesson. Never again would he underestimate the boy in the silver mask. It would take him 10 long years to rebuild the army that Baldwin had destroyed in a single afternoon. For those 10 years, the Kingdom of Jerusalem stood. It stood not because of its walls, or its wealth, or the support of Europe. It stood because of the shadow cast by a dying cripple. Even as Baldwin withered away, becoming blind and bedridden, his mere presence was enough to hold back the tide. Saladin feared him, the Muslim chroniclers, usually quick to mock their enemies, wrote of Baldwin with a strange reverence, calling him a man who had no equal in courage. If only he had a body to match his heart. There is a poignant moment recorded near the end of his life. In 1183, 6 years after the miracle of Montgisard, Saladin returned to besiege the castle of Kerak. Baldwin, now completely blind and unable to move, ordered his men to carry him there in a litter. When Saladin heard that the Leper King had arrived, carried on a stretcher like a holy relic, the Sultan withdrew. He refused to fight the man who had beaten him. He simply left. It was the ultimate testament to the psychological dominance Baldwin held. He didn't need a sword anymore. His will alone was a weapon. But will cannot stop biology forever. In the spring of 1185, at the age of 24, the fight finally ended. The king died. He was buried in the church of the Holy Sepulchre, near the site of Christ's crucifixion. And with his last breath, the soul of the kingdom departed too. The tragedy of Baldwin's story is not that he died young. The tragedy is what happened after he was gone, without the iron will of the Leper King to hold it together. The kingdom of Jerusalem collapsed with shocking speed. The vultures who had circled him in life, the ambitious courtiers, the reckless Templars like Reynald of Châtillon, took the reins of power, lacking Baldwin's wisdom and his terrifying clarity. They rode out to meet Saladin again at the Horns of Hattin in 1187. They had more men than Baldwin had at Montgisard. They had better equipment. They had the element of surprise, but they did not have him. They were slaughtered. Saladin, having waited a decade for the White Death to leave the board, finally checkmated the kingdom. Jerusalem fell 3 months later. The cross that Baldwin had raised in triumph was dragged through the dust of the streets. So, we are left with a haunting question, one that echoes through the centuries. Did Baldwin truly win? If you look at the map, his victory at Montgisard ultimately changed nothing. Jerusalem still fell. The Crusades still ended in failure. The dust of history eventually covered everything he fought to save. But to judge Baldwin by the permanence of his kingdom is to miss the point entirely. His life forces us to confront a terrifying truth about the human condition, that we are all trapped in decaying vessels, all fighting battles we are destined to eventually lose against time and death. Baldwin IV did not fight because he thought he could live forever. He fought because he refused to let his circumstances dictate his reality. In a world that told him he was a curse, a corpse, a mistake, he chose to be a king. He took the broken shards of his life and forged them into a weapon that defied an empire. Saladin, in his later years, was asked about his greatest adversary. He did not name Richard the Lionheart, the warrior king of England. He spoke of the boy who could not walk. Perhaps he understood what we often forget, that true power does not come from the strength of the arm, but from the fire of the spirit that burns, even as the candle melts away. History is filled with men who conquered the world, but there is only one boy who conquered his own fate, if only for an afternoon. As you go back to your lives, to your own battles and your own limitations, ask yourself this: if a dying boy with no hope, no future, and no feeling in his hands could shatter the logic of the world, what excuse do you have for surrendering to yours? The mask of the Leper King remains, staring out from the dark pages of history. It is not looking at Saladin anymore. It is looking at us.